Hi everyone. I'm Omar Kedi, professor of economics and finance at ESADE and director of energy projects at EsadeGeo, the Center for Global Economics and Geopolitics at ESADE. And I'm very thrilled to be welcoming you to this webinar on measures to combat climate dumping. This event is organized by the Observatory EsadeGeo and Fundación Repsol on the geopolitics of the energy transition. This initiative aims at producing and disseminating applied knowledge around two main topics, the climate and energy politics of the European Union and the geopolitics of the energy transition. And we couldn't have a more fitting event today, as we will discuss one of the leading efforts of the European Union to address climate change, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM. This ambitious policy aims at leveling the playing field and incentivizing stricter climate regulations globally, by taking account the carbon footprint of the entire global supply chain. And this way, hoping to avoid climate dumping. And to discuss the CBAM, we are very delighted to have two leading experts, which will give their perspective from the point of view of policymaking and that of the private sector that needs to adopt the policy. And so today, we're very happy to have with us Vicente Hurtado Roa, which is the head of unit at the European Commission that focuses on CBAM, energy, and the green taxation. So hello, Vicente, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Omar. Good morning, everyone, and thanks a lot to ESADE for this opportunity to be able to explain a bit better about CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and more in particular where we are now and what are the challenges before the end of this year and before we start with the definitive period in 2026. Maybe just a short reminder about what CBAM is for those of you who are less familiar with the CBAM. You know that
Vicente, just a second. Let me just to introduce also briefly Dan, and I'm going to give the word to you. Sorry, just quickly, just a second. So we have then also Dan Maleski, who is like the lead CBAM advisor at Ratio Advisors and visiting research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Hello, Dan, and thank you for being with us.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you very much for having me.
And before kicking off the debate and give the word back to Vicente, let me also welcome Raquel Guindo-Martin from the Fundación Repsol, which is our partner in organizing this event. So Raquel, thank you so much for being with us, and leave you the floor for some introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you, Omar. Good morning and welcome to everyone connected to this webinar organized by Repsol Foundation and EsadeGeo. First of all, I would like to thank ESADE for this collaboration within the EsadeGeo Repsol Foundation Observatory of Geopolitics of the energy transition, with the objective to produce and spread know-how about the energy transition in the society. This objective is served by Repsol Foundation with Open Room, a community on energy transition that has more than 38,000 users already, where we promote to a spread of know-how about the circular economy, sustainable mobility, decarbonization of industry, and other topics from academic rigor and critical thinking. Therefore, I also want to thank the two experts, Vicente Hurtado and Dan Maleski, who will join us at this webinar for sharing their expertise on the topic of this webinar. And thanks to all of you who are watching this event. I would like to continue my speech by sharing with you some reflection on energy transition and industry. We know the loss of weight of the European industry in recent years because of the decision we have made in Europe so far. As the Draghi report mentioned, we have lost 12% of energy-intensive industry, with the demand for the product we've obtained from them at continues to grow on the planet. This demand has shifted to regions with sufficient industrial capacity to meet their needs. We export the industry to those regions, and also the CO2 emission from that activity. In other words, emissions from manufacturing and are transferred from a country with strict environmental policies to another country with less strict policies. This is the result of the phenomenon called climate dumping. We're at a key stage with the start of a new political cycle in the European Union, as this new cycle must be a turning point to improve the competitiveness of the European industry and eliminate the obstacles that today slow down innovation and investment. And what are the causes of the loss of the competitiveness? I would like to focus on two key factors, especially in the energy sector. Energy prices are much higher in Europe than in China and the United States. In Europe, we have decided to give up the exploitation of the hydrocarbons. Now we face the challenge of reducing the cost of decarbonization. To do this, it's important to reduce the price of CO2 or revert this cost to the industry to assume it in their transition process, allowing them to reinvest those funds in the decarbonization project. This measure will allow companies to continue reducing emissions without reducing their economic competitiveness. This strategy should be maintained until a bidirectional and effective CBAM is implemented. Once developed, this will balance market conditions and will ensure that European industry are not at disadvantage with countries with more lax environmental regulation. In this way, a more equitable and sustainable global transition is contributed. Regulation is another factor. No? Today, there is a lack of innovation and excessive regulation in current and without economic valuation of its application. Although the omnibus package has been a positive step for the simplification, there is still an important amount of unnecessary bureaucracy. Europe has to lead the fight against climate change, but without losing growth. We must balance sustainability, competitiveness, and economic growth, but not only look up an environmental aspect, but also the long-term economic viability. The energy transition is an opportunity to create new value chains and transform current industry. For that, we must take advantage of the competitive advantages we have over all our competitors, where energy and industry go hand in hand. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy this webinar, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raquel. At EsadeGeo, we are delighted to be partnering with Fundación Repsol on this very important initiative, the observatory. And so before giving the word to Vicente, just to piece of information. So first, we're going to try to keep the discussion as dynamic as possible within Vicente and Dan. And also, after their initial remarks, we're also going to start a round of questions, which, if time permits, we also hope to be including some of the questions that come from the audience. So I strongly recommend all of you that are watching this event to write your question in the chat. We'll be reading you and hopefully include your contribution into the webinar. So please do so. And so without further ado, so let me give the floor to Vicente. Again, we are extremely happy and glad to have you with us today. And so Vicente, the floor is yours.
Thank you again, Omar. And as you can see, I'm also excited for being here. So I hope that I will bring some more light on what CBAM is and also where we are and the challenges, as I was saying before. And just a short reminder, maybe for those of you who are not so familiar with the CBAM, with the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, all started in 2019 when the President von der Leyen, who was just appointed, made as a centerpiece or a center or a focus of her first commission on the green transition of energy in the European Union and also of technologies. And this is why the communication on the European Green Deal was adopted. And then as part of that, the translation into legislation was in July 2021, when the Commission adopted the call for 55 package, where the Commission, the European Union, was raising its level of ambition to reduce emissions by 2030 above 55%, which is a very high increase of ambition. But this, of course, was going to be accompanied by amendments to the ETS, to the emission trading system. And also the reality is that as the Commission or the European Union is increasing its level of ambition, but the rest of the world is not doing the same, of course, all the efforts of the EU industry, all the efforts of the EU citizens can be completely watered down and completely offset and reduced because, of course, of increasing emissions around the globe. We know that the fight against climate change is a challenge for the whole world, and this is why we thought that the carbon border adjustment mechanism could be a good measure and tool to complement the EU ETS. To complement, because on one hand, we are also reducing the free allowances which are given to the EU industry in the ETS. And this is also because of the introduction of the CBAM. I will refer to that later on from 2026. And then on the same time, because what we wanted to make sure is that goods imported into the EU, or a number of goods for the CBAM sectors which are imported into the EU, apply the same climate policies or apply the same rules as those produced in the EU. We don't want to discriminate. So we treat in the same way those produced in the EU as those imported into the EU. And this is why the CBAM brings a new price or a new carbon price on the imported goods where there was no carbon price paid at the source. As you also know, of course, if a carbon price was paid at the source, this can be deducted from the CBAM adjustment. From the very beginning, we saw that CBAM has been having some effects. We could see that many third countries are enhancing their carbon pricing or introducing carbon pricing, and it's not by surprise that they also do that in the sectors which are covered by the CBAM. As you know, the sectors are iron, steel, aluminum, fertilizer, cement, but also electricity and hydrogen. The idea is not to introduce a trade barrier. CBAM is not a trade measure, it's not a competitiveness measure, it's a measure to promote the carbonization of the production of these goods, and as I said before, in the EU by reducing the free allowances, but also on the importation of goods from third countries. But not only carbon pricing is being introduced or enhanced in some third countries, and I can give you some examples like Turkey, but also China, who is now expanding ETS or has plans to expand ETS, but also other countries are introducing ETS. But also is an incentive to many companies to decarbonize. And let's be clear again, I mean, CBAM doesn't target countries, so we don't treat countries differently. What we target is companies, because we know that companies in every country have different level of carbon intensity. Like in the EU, we know that in other countries, there are companies which are less intensive in carbon emissions, while others are still more reliant on old, more polluting technologies. So by introducing CBAM, we could also see that the market is readjusting, and that, for example, importers in the EU are very much more interested more and more in making sure that they import greener goods, because the adjustment with the CBAM will be lower, but not only for that, also because they will be able to claim that their products are greener. So the CBAM can contribute to the carbonization by enhancing carbon pricing, but at the same time by putting some pressure on companies to decarbonize. We decided to bring CBAM in a sequential way, first starting with a transitional period that kicked in last October 2023, and which will last until the end of this year, where there are no financial obligations. We are just asking importers to report on a quarterly basis the imported CBAM goods, the carbon intensity of those goods, and whether some carbon price has been paid, and of course the origin of the goods, because this data, which is being collected by the Commission and also by member states, which will help us to finalize the system, and I will refer to that, and then to come from 2026 with financial obligations. But even from 2026, the financial obligations will be kicked in gradually, because from 26 to 2034, the free allocation in the ETS for the CBAM sectors will be phased out, not in a gradual way, slower at the beginning with a small reduction of the free allowances by 2.5% in the first 2 years, but then by 2030, the reduction will be nearly 50%, and then by 2034 there will not be more free allowances in the system. So this is why we are accelerating, of course, the introduction of the CBAM as we are phasing out the free allowances. And why? Because, as I said at the beginning, we want to treat all goods in the same way, and as long as there are free allowances and the benchmarks for free allowances in the EU ETS, this will be also recognized to the imported goods. In other words, if we have a benchmark of, for example, let's take 1 ton of CO2 per ton of product for a specific CM code for a specific good in the CBAM scope, emissions, if the intensity of the emissions of the imported goods are below, they will not pay any CBAM in 2026. However, if they are above the threshold, they will have to pay on the excess. Since the free allowances, the benchmarks are being reduced over time until 2034, of course, the increase of the CBAM adjustment will also be increasing. So in other words, we have a transitional period, which is a period for everyone to learn. And then, of course, we have a gradual introduction or a slow introduction of CBAM in particular until 2030, and from 26 to 2034 to take into account also the free allowances. We are working now, from now until the end of the year, on a number of things, on a big number of implementing and delegated regulations in order to come up with some of the details for the implementation of the CBAM from next year. For example, in terms of verification of the emissions, there is no obligation of verifying the emissions now in the transitional period, but from 2026, of course, the emissions will have to be verified by an external verifier. So we are working on the verification reports. We are working on who can be a verifier. The accreditation of the verifiers will be done at EU level, but now we are working on who can be a verifier. But we are also working on other things, like, for example, on the deduction of the carbon price. So what carbon price can be deducted? We have a definition in the CBAM regulation. So normally it should be some sort of ETS or carbon tax. But we are, of course, working on some of the modalities, how to translate the level of carbon price from an installation level to good levels, and also how to certify or to validate also the carbon price which has been effectively paid in a third country. But we are working also on a number of other things. And what is important, I think, in order to make a good calculation from 26 of the number of emissions and therefore of the number of the CBAM certificates that will need to be bought by the importers, is to know the default values, because there is always the possibility to use default values, as there is the possibility to use also the actual emissions. We are working also on those benchmarks for the free allocation that I mentioned before, which are being phased out from 26 to 2034. So every year we will come with a list of benchmarks to take into account also the reduction of those benchmarks over the time. And we are also working on the finalization of the methodology to assess the emissions. For all that, and also taking into account the experience in the transitional period, we are now working on simplifications. The Commission adopted a proposal to simplify CBAM last 26th of February. This is under discussions in the Council, but also in the Parliament. We realized that a big number of importations of CBAM goods and emissions were concentrated in a very low number of importers. There is something like less than 1% of the emissions are concentrated in less than 20% of the importers. So this is why we are coming with a threshold. The threshold that we are proposing is 50 tons of mass of material imported into the EU for the 4 main sectors. Will not be to be necessary for reporting. So if you are importing less than 50 tons, you are not obliged to comply with the CBAM regulations, and that will simplify a lot. But we are also simplifying some other aspects, like, for example, the authorization process, how to use the carbon price, or, for example, the obligations to buy the CBAM certificates. For 2026, it will be a very special year. We know that there is a need for more time. So this is why the obligation to buy the certificates for 26 will will be brought into 2027 or will be moved to 2027. Also, the obligation for reporting, which will be on an annual basis, and the need to surrender the CBAM certificates that cover the emissions of the imported goods will move from May possibly to August of September. So the first reporting period will be in August of September 2027. So in 2026, there will be still time to understand, to make the estimations, calculations, and to buy the CBAM certificates in 2027. Let's be clear, we are not postponing the introduction of CBAM. CBAM will apply with financial obligations from January 2026, but all the obligations in relation to buying certificates and to surrender and to report will be, of course, moved to 27 and even to the end of 2027. Besides simplifying, which has been always a driver for the Commission, there is also another conundrum, which is, of course, the concerns of the EU industry. And also Raquel was referring to the Draghi's report, where the CBAM is also mentioned, which refers to the effectiveness of the CBAM implementation and to avoid the possibilities for circumvention. This is why, as announced in the recent Steel and Metals Action Plan, the Commission is working, or we are working at this moment, on a communication on exports. As you know, the CBAM only applies to the imports, but there is no option for exports. One of the concerns of the EU industry has been what happens with the risk of carbon leakage for the exports of the CBAM goods to markets, to countries where there is no carbon pricing, and therefore the situation is quite uneven. So the Commission will come with a communication on possible options by the end of this quarter, so before the summer. And we are also working on a proposal by the end of this year in order to extend the scope of the CBAM to the downstream goods. Take the example of cars or fridges. I mean, goods which are intensive in the use of steel or aluminum or other CBAM goods, and also to reinforce the anti-circumvention measures and what we call, for example, the risk of unfaithful resource shuffling. So this will be part of a proposal by the end of the year. And finally, just to say that all this experience in the transitional period, which will be reflected in the simplifications, which will be reflected in the proposal by the end of the year, will also be part of a review report that the Commission will be adopting by the end of this year. And there we will reflect on other issues, like, for example, the extension of the scope to other sectors. Take the example of chemicals and polymers, or it could be glass and other sectors. I mean, I'm not saying that we are expanding. I'm saying that we will be analyzing, of course, the extension of the scope. It doesn't mean that it will be from 26. It will be later in any case. And we are also, for example, reflecting on other things like the impact on third countries, on least developed countries in particular, governance issues, and also when it comes, for example, to more technical issues like the extension of indirect emissions also to the rest of the sectors, and not only to cement and fertilizers like at present. So all these will be part of the work of this year. As you can see, it's a very challenging year. We really want to take stock of the experience in the first 2.5 or 2.25 years of application of the CBAM, and we are trying to make sure that CBAM will achieve its objectives from 2026. Thank you very much, and I will be happy with taking your questions, Omar.
Thank you, Vicente. Thank you. Very like a master class on the CBAM. I guess we're very happy to hear firsthand from one of the policymakers, which are defining all the details of this policy. And also, I really like the way that you combine the ambition of the policy with also the effort in simplifying all the procedures to hopefully let companies to comply with it. And so I think we can now complement your views with those of Dan, which day in and day out talks to and advises companies on how to comply with the CBAM. So then, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I wanted to begin my time on stage by saying, in my eyes, it's fairly easy to, let's be honest, criticize and condemn mechanisms such as the EU ETS and the EU CBAM. Let's be honest, as most webinars do, right? Try and pick apart the flaws. But really, what I want to emphasize is I want to express my admiration for all of those involved in building mechanisms such as the CBAM and ETS to help tackle decarbonization. Let's not forget this is probably the largest challenge of our generation. And as a result, I wanted to salute, not only Vicente and his team, but as well everyone in the audience today for doing their best to, help us collaborate to build this mechanism to create a strong and powerful policy to protect EU industry, but also incentivize third countries. So with that being said, please don't hesitate to drop your questions and whatnot in the comment section. I'm sure we'd be more than happy to elaborate them to hopefully build a stronger policy later on. So in the next call, 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to be providing a bit of clarity on some of the risks and opportunities and challenges that our clients are facing when it comes to the CBAM. And realistically speaking, there's three main types of concerns and whatnot and opportunities companies have. I'm not going to really touch on the compliance headaches that CBAM creates. Realistically, I think that's covered a lot. I feel like the angle is almost always talked about in every, again, news article, webinar, podcast I've always touched on. What I don't think is touched on even remotely close enough as much as it should be is the financial and competitive risks and opportunities created by mechanisms such as the CBAM. So let's break this down a bit. We're going to start with the opportunity, right? So what is the opportunity that our clients see when it comes to the CBAM? Now, to answer that question, we're going to actually look at not just the CBAM, but really any cost of carbon. Because any cost of carbon really is the same thing, which is just creating an asymmetrical landscape. An asymmetrical landscape because companies in this jurisdiction are required to procure this cost of carbon. And inherently, an advantage comes really quickly with a landscape like that. The advantage is if a company can procure carbon at a lower cost than their competition, well, they can simply bake in less cost into their finished goods, providing them either with higher profits or a better chance of competitiveness. And so to paint a really simple picture about this, let's take jet fuel, for example. Let's say there's two airlines. You have airline number one, airline number two. Airline number one can purchase their jet fuel at half the cost of airline number two. The resulting of that, of course, is airline number one is going to be very happy. Come bonus season, everyone's going to be very, very happy. Now, the exact same thing happens with CBAM, right? Because we're looking at an asymmetrical landscape. So if we're looking at the CBAM, and if I'm speaking with our companies, our clients, if a CBAM company can effectively forward hedge their CBAM certificate exposure, just like how an airplane company could potentially hedge their jet fuel, they can be at a significant advantage. Let's say right now in 2025, I get a call from a company who wants to forward hedge their CBAM certificate costs. I can lock in their costs at, let's say, 65 euros per ton right now. Now that's 65 euros for one company. Let's say another company waits until 2026 to start buying their CBAM certificates. Sorry, not buying, but incurring the cost, as Vicente said. The cost still incurs in 2026. That cost, so that CBAM cost, is expected to be around 110 euros per ton for a CBAM certificate, right? And so right there, automatically, we're talking about quite a large delta, 60 euros, give or take. And so this is exactly what our clients and what Retro Advisors has been executing for a while, allowing companies to significantly lower their cost when it comes to the cost of CBAM and the EU ETS. Now, that's the opportunity, i.e. to forward hedge. Now, the risk that CBAM creates is for companies who don't do anything, right? You can either be proactive in, let's say, forward hedge, or reactive and don't do anything at all. And I want to elaborate on just how important this is. Now, to best give an example, we're going to actually not look at the EU CBAM, rather the EU ETS. The EU ETS, for those who don't know, is the European Union Emissions Trading System. It's really what the CBAM is trying to strengthen and protect. It's been going around for about 20 years. In the EU ETS, there's around 10,000 installations that are forced to participate. These installations are paying tens to hundreds of million euros a year to comply with carbon. However, because it's a market-based mechanism, companies choose how they want to interact with this cost of carbon based on how they want to do business. And the result of this is most of European industry is forward hedged in this market. If I look at some of the most famous examples, RWE, the largest German power generator, in 2019 did a 10-year forward hedge. So they spent billions of euros buying carbon that they're going to need in the future because they know that that carbon is going to be more expensive in the future. See, the EU ETS, in my eyes, is the most unique market in the world. Now, it's because how it's designed. The result of how it's designed, i.e. a cap and trade mechanism, results in EUAs, European Union allowances, going in expected to increase year on year on year. So much so by 2035, most analysts anticipate one EUA to be around 250 euros. Now, CBAM certificates are directly correlated to the primary market of the EU ETS, meaning one CBAM certificate is going to be around 250 euros. So if I give you the choice today, you can either buy a CBAM certificate now for 65 euros or wait and have to buy one at 250 euros. Now, this might only sound like a few hundred euros more expensive, but if you look at the economics of this, this is significant. We are anticipating cement prices, let's say from Turkey into the EU, so cement exported from Turkey into the EU, to be around 400 to 600% more expensive by 2032. 600% more expensive. However, if Çimsa or Medsem or one of these Turkish cement companies hedge like their European counterparts do, they might only have to increase their cement or clinker costs by, let's say, 30 to 40%. Right? We're talking a magnitude of difference when it comes to the competitiveness. And here's the catch. Most EU cement companies, because they work for, we know they're our clients, are hedged well into the 2030s. So they will not have to buy a single dollar worth of carbon for 6 to 7 to 8 years, meaning they can bake in a significantly lower cost of carbon, let's say at 30 or 40 euros per ton that they procured in, let's say, 2021, I don't know, or 2018, compared to their Turkish or Egyptian, Moroccan, or Taiwanese counterpart, because of CBAM, is going to be procuring them at, let's say, their CBAM certificates at, let's say, 160, 170, 200 euros per ton. Now, this is the opportunities and risk that CBAM creates. Now, I don't want to be here for an hour and bore you all to death on the economics of this, but it's quite significant. The other risks that the CBAM creates when it comes to our clients is a bit more deeper than just how companies interact with it. Rather, it's how the economics of a cost of carbon incorporate itself on sectors. Now, this is not just CBAM related, it's also the EU ETS. Both of these mechanisms rely on something called the marginal abatement cost curve to incentivize behavior change with industry and utilities exposed to the mechanism. What is the marginal abatement cost curve, you can ask, and it's another acronym. It's called the MAC. I know we love our acronyms here. The marginal abatement cost curve is more or less the economics of how companies incorporate themselves when it comes to a cost of carbon. Really simple example. Let's take power generation. So let's say I'm the European power complex, and I am now exposed to a 30 euro cost of carbon. So to make 1 ton of carbon, I need to buy 30 euros worth of, let's say in this case, EUAs, right? The result of this is I'm going to change how I create my electricity. Before, I might use coal and lignite to create my power, but coal and lignite is quite carbon intensive. And so because I have this cost of carbon, it might make it unprofitable to burn coal and lignite. Therefore, I'll fuel switch to gas, which is exactly what has happened in the European power sector since 2012, when free allocation was phased away in phase 2 of the EU ETS. EU power has been more or less significantly fuel switching to gas, and at this rate, it's significant. Renewables are so it's in some countries north of 50% of all generation. And one of the main reasons is the marginal abatement cost curve. However, and this is very, very key, the marginal abatement cost curve works very circumstantially, sector by sector by sector. Power might only need a 30 euro cost of carbon to fuel switch, but let's say cement might need a 300 euro cost of carbon. Cement, for example, is very hard to abate. You can do some low-hanging fruit, right? You can change your clinker ratio, you can do some energy efficiency, but there isn't really much you can do after that besides, let's say, CCS and CCUS, which you need a significantly high cost of carbon, which we're nowhere near. Meaning, cement is in a really hard place, because it's unprofitable for them to invest in, let's say, decarbonization solutions such as CCS, because they won't make any money because it's too expensive and the cost of carbon isn't high enough. But the cost of carbon is still high enough where it's making them significantly bake in that cost. So let's say I buy 1 ton of cement right now in Poland, around 30% of the entire cost of that ton of cement constitutes the cost of carbon. But what can that cement company do? Because they need a cost of carbon much higher than, let's say, 65 euros or even 150 euros to invest profitably in CCS. So they're forced to use these financial mechanisms, i.e. hedge. And they can do this because they're educated on the EU ETS, because they've been in this market for 20 years and they work with us. But a lot of our, and not just us, but banks and everyone else who can provide them and help navigate them. But most of the other folks in CBAM don't even know what, now they know what the EU ETS stand for, but 2 years ago they didn't. So how were they supposed to hedge in 2019 or 2018 before the MSR when they can get a 30 or 40 euro handle on an EUA? Now that's something they can't do. And so it's very difficult for our clients to navigate this. And so that's some of the opportunities and risks that the CBAM creates. Again, I could ramble on for another hour on this, but I don't want to have everyone fall asleep. So with that being said, perhaps I can pass the microphone over to Amar and we can get into some questions.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think we can open up to questions. Again, I would like to let you all of you know that you can type them in the chat. We'll be reading you. And I will first start with the question to Vicente. We, like, from your address, we have been seeing that you have a very busy time with a long roadmap, plenty of initiatives. And so one of them is, like, the Commission is working on a communication on how to address the risk of carbon leakage for the exports of CBAM goods. So can you please provide more insights on this issue?
Indeed, Omar, thanks a lot for the question. As I mentioned before, the CBAM only introduces an adjustment when goods are imported into the EU. And at the same time that we are introducing CBAM from 26 to 2034, the free allocation under the EU ETS will be also phased out. This has raised a concern among the EU industry, which says that by removing the free allocation and introducing CBAM, there might be an impact on the exports of the EU goods to the countries, and therefore there might be a risk also of carbon leakage with respect to the goods exported, in the sense that as the European Union is paying a full, or the companies in the European Union is paying a full carbon price, this, of course, cannot compare with, for example, the carbon price which is paid by other countries or by companies in other countries, and therefore that may have an impact in the sense that there might be an advantage for those goods, and therefore for keeping high emissions or level of emissions around the globe. So this is why we decided that we will look at this question again. I mean, that was something that we looked at in 2021, and because of the slow phase-in of the CBAM and the slow phase-out of the free allowances, we didn't think that there was such an important impact. But in the carbon markets report that was adopted last year, the Commission was already looking at the number of the CBAM goods, and we were identifying some of those goods where, because of the carbon intensity also, and because of the tradability or exportability or exports of those goods, we think that there might be a risk of carbon leakage. So now in this communication, we will be looking at the possibilities, how to deal with this risk of carbon leakage. First, to identify the goods which are at risk, and second, what could be the options and the measures that could be taken in order to complement also the CBAM on imports. Then, of course, from there will have to be a decision on what type of measure and by when, and that will be part, of course, of a future proposal. But that's something, of course, that will need to be reassessed in the light of the communication and also in the light of the discussion with the stakeholders. Perfect. In any case, Omar, I just want to emphasize that, as we did with the introduction of the CBAM and with the CBAM on imports, one important principle, of course, is the respect of all our international engagements, including WTO. So whatever we will propose or we may be considering has to be compatible with the WTO rules.
Perfect. Yeah. So thank you so much. Yes, indeed, there's a lot of debate on to what extent CBAM is compliant to WTO, even though I know that you're fully confident than it is, that it's kind of defining the same regulation on domestic and foreign companies. So, like, maybe we can go back to this issue also on connecting CBAM to the current also trade and geopolitical situation later on. So maybe now we can switch quickly to then with the second question, which is like, you have been giving us a lot of insights on, you know, how like CBAM is affecting the economic decisions of companies, but can you give us maybe kind of more of concrete examples? No, so I think it would be very good to have a better grasp on how the private sector is dealing with it.
So let's say hypothetically, I'm some kind of private equity company, and I want to buy a cement mill for some reason. I want to build a cement mill. Okay, so if I'm clever enough, I'm going to know cost of carbon is going to be quite important in the future. So let me go get educated on this cost of carbon thing. First thing I'm going to find is Europe is about a country mile ahead of everyone else, not just because when you Google an EUA it's more expensive, rather because of how the EU ETS is designed. So I'm a private equity company. I'm looking in, let's say, 3 jurisdictions. I'm looking either build my cement mill in, let's say, Turkey, in the EU, and let's say Egypt, or just hypothetically. So I'm going to be aware that the EU ETS is going to be, you know, quite important to understand. I'm also going to be very aware that I'm quite confident in the future of this mechanism, because Vincente's colleagues have done a great job in providing industry a roadmap of the future, right? Investment needs confidence. Confidence means you need some kind of future guarantee that the mechanism's still there, you know, the environment is still somewhat similar, so you feel safe with your investment. The issue, though, and one of the main issues, is with countries responding to the EU CBAM, we don't really know how they're going to respond and why. Let's take an example. Let's take Turkey. So Turkey is currently looking at incorporating an ETS. Sadly, it was it was in Parliament last week. It got postponed a bit. It's still most likely going to happen, but might get delayed a bit. Nevertheless, they're looking at an ETS. The issue, though, is you can't take these ETSs and compare them apples to apples, because they're almost always apples to orange. Let's take, as of right now, there's 38 ETSs in the world. None of them are anything remotely similar, except maybe the EU and UK ETS. Let's take an example. Let's take the Chinese ETS and the EU ETS. EU ETS has an absolute cap. China has a relative cap. EU ETS is phasing out free allocation. China basically allocates everything. A lot of our clients in China, for example, they profit from their ETS because they get more allowances than they need. They just go to the secondary market, sell it, and they're happy. That's not called climate change. That's called subsidization. In the EU ETS, you have a very liquid market with speculators. It's a very healthy market. In the Chinese ETSs, in most ETSs in the world, South Korea, China, Australia, most are liquid. So it's very hard to even interact with them. And so when we try, if I'm an investor trying to analyze the geopolitical and landscape of the CBAM, it's a mess because I can't really compare them level to level. And so that's one of the main issues when it comes to our clients trying to navigate this. The other issue, as I mentioned, is with countries responding to the CBAM with their own cost of carbon. Creating a cost of carbon inherently incurs carbon leakage. What do you do with carbon leakage? Well, you can do the Band-Aid attempt, which is free allocation, but free allocation is temporary. You can't subsidize an issue. I mean, the US is trying to do that with the IRA, just tossing money at it, but it's a very short-term solution. The second thing with free allocation is, because of cap and trade market, after a while, it's going to run out, you know. That's why the EU ETS can't use free allocation forever. By 2039, the cap will go to 0. And so they're forced to create their own BCA. And so as a result of the EU CBAM, we're going to see a lot of responses from countries incorporating ETSs, and then they will also respond with their own border carbon adjustments. So we have Turkey already looking at a BCA, same with Australia, same with South Korea, same with Taiwan. They've already said yes. Norway's already said yes. US is looking at 3 possible BCAs, if you can even call them that. Same with Canada, same with a bunch of these other jurisdictions that we're speaking with that haven't officially announced it yet. So what we're going to see in like 5 or 6 years from now is a polarized world of all of these ETSs and BCAs that don't really interact well. They don't really match in many regards, resulting in a trade to be hindered. If I look at the 1930s smartly tariff, what did we see in the 1930s? We saw trade plummet because trade is not good with tension. Tension is very inefficient for trade. And so those are the issues that if I'm a private equity client, I'm looking at right now, and I'm very concerned as a result of the CBAM. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I shall say that, of course, part of the idea of the CBAM was also to try to push other jurisdictions, not to apply similar mechanisms. And then, of course, this, as you well mentioned, might like increase trade tensions in times in which maybe there's enough of it. But also, I also see it as an opportunity, not right? Also, like in order to push forward the agenda on the energy transition. So that there would be, of course, as you well say, how to find common grounds in order to set regulation that can connect all these different policies.
Quickly, I mean, to follow up on this, the EU is leading by example. You know, again, I said at the very beginning, it's really easy to criticize. You know, it goes back to the man in the arena speech given, I think, in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt, right? You know, the EU's trying this. You know, it's really easy to criticize a person who's trying this, but we have to admire that they're actually doing this. They're not just talking about it. They're actually incorporating the EU ETS and the EU CBAM. They're risking their own industry. And so it's really easy for ministries all around the world to come and criticize the EU, but at the end of the day, they're doing everything they can to stop climate change. You know, that does take a moment to say, you know, I salute you guys. But with it, of course, there's gonna be a bumpy road. No one's done this before. But again, we should, I think, appreciate what we're trying to do here, which is to solve the biggest issue of our generation.
Yeah, indeed. And yeah, so I will say that, you know, with Tente then is really like leading this effort in a policy that a few years ago looked kind of maybe not so promising compared to what are the results right now, as again many other jurisdictions following the example of the policy you are defining. So following up on that, so since there are going to be more and more efforts from other jurisdictions to follow up, so we can take a question from Luca Stelli on how will then the EU assess the equivalence of climate policies and carbon pricing mechanism in third countries, and yeah, how you can connect them to those of the EU.
Well, I mean, we don't intend to analyze every carbon policy or climate policy in every country because, of course, as you can imagine, that would be a huge work. What is important is that we are, of course, accepting the deduction of the carbon price, effective carbon price, and let me underline that it has to be an effective carbon price paid at the source. We are working now on the rules how to make it effective or how to implement this possibility, this option, because it's not so simple. Normally, carbon price is calculated at the basis of an installation or the basis of a company, and then we need to reassess, as we do for the emissions, we need to do the same for the carbon price at the level of the goods. So what we want is to make sure that there will be some sort of validation, certification of the carbon price, and this will have to be, of course, assigned at the level of the goods. We know that this is going to be complex. We want to give this deduction first because, well, we think it's fair. We don't want to have a double carbon price. As I said, CBAM applies the EU ETS price to the imported goods. If some ETS price has been paid or carbon tax has been paid, it should be deducted. But this can be also a bit complex at the same time. So this is why, as part of the package for the simplifications, we are coming with this idea also of default values for carbon price. It's something similar to the default values for emissions. So if you don't want to calculate exactly your carbon price paid specifically for that good, we intend to make some sort of estimations of the carbon price. Is will have to be different from one good to another, from one sector to another, and from one country to another. And this is going to be, of course, a big challenge. But the idea is to analyze those systems which are transparent, which are well known. And then on the basis of that, we can recognize some sort of default carbon price to those goods imported into the EU. But this is the way how we take into account, of course, the efforts of third countries in order to decarbonize. You were talking about trade tensions. We've been very careful to talk to, or we have taken a lot of time to talk to many countries. I can tell you that our experience shows that at the very beginning, the stance was, no, I don't like CBAM. It's a trade measure. It's a competitiveness measure. You are introducing a new tariff on imported goods, and this is not WTO compliant. As they start to understand how CBAM works, and they are also increasing their level of ambition and their commitments under the Paris Agreement to decarbonize, they are starting to understand how CBAM applies, and they can see CBAM as an opportunity. it's a challenge, but at the same time, it's an opportunity for them to introduce carbon pricing. They know that by introducing carbon pricing, they will be able to collect the revenues that they can recycle into their exporting companies or into the decarbonization of their own companies. And it can also be a way to introduce some sort of monitoring, reporting, and verification rules in their countries. So things are evolving, and also other countries are considering the introduction of CBAM. I mean, we talk to countries that sometimes at the beginning were criticizing CBAM, and now they are considering that as they will be also increasing their level of ambition, they will have the same problem of the risk of carbon leakage with other countries. And this is why they are also considering why not the introduction of CBAM. So all these things are evolving, and I think that the good news is that everybody sees at the CBAM as something that can be, of course, an opportunity rather than a challenge.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up, like a question of Bernardo Nascimento on, so if the EU decides to link the ETS with the UK ETS, what consequences would this have for the CBAM besides the sort of derogation? So I think it will be, again, on a matter of understanding how these two ETS combine, and then, so if you can elaborate on that.
No, for sure. I mean, I mentioned that CBAM applies at the level of companies, not at the level of countries. There is one exception, which is the situation of the EEA countries and the EFTA countries. Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, they apply the EU ETS, and this is why goods produced in those countries exported to the EU do not fall into the scope of the ETS, or in other words, of the CBAM. In other words, they are exempted from the CBAM. I have to say that also Norway and Iceland are working now on the introduction of CBAM, possibly from 2027. And there is also the case of Switzerland, where the ETS in Switzerland is linked to the EU ETS. This is the only case in the world. And this is also why we don't apply CBAM to the Swiss goods, or in other words, there is an exemption or an out of the scope for the ETS in Switzerland. The same will happen to the UK. If in the end there is a linkage, or the ETS in the UK is linked to the EU ETS, that means that in terms of CBAM, of course, there will be an exemption. You know that the UK is also introducing the CBAM, so at the same time, there should be some sort of exemption on both sides. It would be like an extended application of the CBAM, or of course of the ETS at UK, with the same rules to the UK into the EU. That would solve a lot of problems, and of course that would help a lot.
So then, do you want to have a quick follow-up?
If I could quickly jump in. So just a bit more clarity on linking conversations. So for anyone taking notes, the big data circle is May 19th. That is where there will be some discussions potentially regarding linking. Linking, of course, could be beneficial. The UK ETS is very illiquid. It also could help with a few other issues that the UK ETS struggles with. However, in the last 3 years, the UK ETS has made some decisions that have made it not as homogeneous as the EU ETS. They've introduced, for example, the CCM. I mean, if I even look at sectors, for example, sure, it isn't necessarily apples it's not apples and oranges, but it's not necessarily the exact same. But the one good news, though, is the UK ETS structurally is more ambitious than the EU ETS, meaning UKAs should have a premium over EUAs about around 2027. Meaning, even if there's no linking, the delta between the two mechanisms, more or less from a financial perspective, means that UK exports to the EU most likely would not incur a very large CBAM exposure, because again, if I'm UK ETS exposed, I'm paying 120 euros per ton of carbon, and I'm exporting into the EU, and they're only exposed, I'd say, 110 euros per ton of carbon. You know, I'm not going to be paying much to the coffers of Brussels. Now, that is very sector specific, because, for example, the benchmarking for UK ETS cement is terrible. So UK ETS cement is overallocated, and that's a different conversation. But to take a really easy example, UK power exports right now really wouldn't have much of a financial incursion of the EU CBAM. UK power has no free allocation. UK power is also exposed to something called the CPS, carbon price support, which is about £18, meaning the delta between the mechanisms would more or less be parity. Of course, that would go away if the linking does occur. I'm sure we are familiar with the leaks that the FT reported, I think, a month ago. So there is some discussions, but again, circle May 19th. We might get some more information on or around that date regarding the potential here.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And so for the next question, like again from the audience, is from Cosmina Serban, that for Vicente, when will the benchmarks for the CBAM and the default values for 2026 will be published? Hold on, let's go on, sorry.
Sorry, no, I mentioned that we are working on 3 important elements, which are basic in order to calculate your emissions of the imported goods. One is, of course, to finalize the methodology. We have a methodology for the transitional period. We are trying to simplify this methodology and also to improve the methodology for the definitive period. Linked to that, we need to finalize, of course, the new default values in case you don't want to use actual emissions, but you want to rely on something which is a standard, is the default values per country. We published a list in December 2023, which is an average of the world. This is, if you want to know more, this is based on a report of the Joint Research Center of the Commission, the JRC, of September 2023. That's based on world averages. Now we want to work on national averages per country. And the third element is the benchmarks, and the benchmarks of the free allocation for every CN code. The problem is that takes time. There are benchmarks in the EU ETS. We start from the benchmarks in the EU ETS, but the benchmarks in the ETS, there are only like 12 benchmarks. They do not cover all goods. They are at the level of installation of productions of installations. So we need to adapt them to the CN codes. That's something that we are working on also with a consultant, an external consultant. But this is also very much linked to the finalization of the methodology. So in a nutshell, all the 3 elements will be published before the end of this year. They will be part of an implementing regulation. So there will be an implementing regulation with the methodology, but also with the benchmarks and possibly with the default values, or the default values will be part of a separate publication. We are still discussing how to do that. But in any case, all these will be adopted in the last quarter of this year. This is why we know that we are coming late. We know that companies are a bit anxious to know and to make their calculations. So this is how I said before that for 2026, there won't be any obligation to buy CBAM certificates. The obligation will start in February 2027, covering, of course, the importations in 2026, but there won't be any obligation on a quarterly basis to buy CBAM certificates. This is what we call the 80% rule, which now will be reduced to 50%, but these obligations will be moved to 2027. So before the end of the year.
Perfect. And then instead, like related to your, like interaction and experience with your clients, what would be then the piece of regulation / simplification that you think would be most important in order to make the CBAM successful?
Well, I mean, define success, because the success lies in the eye of the beholder. Success is going to be different for aluminium, power, cement. I mean, again, I don't want to. Sometimes I feel bad for the European Commission of how many, especially the benchmark question, how often they ask it. That's the question I get asked the most. But again, as Vicente mentioned, JRC has 12 benchmarks for the ETS. I believe the EU CBAM has 752 CN codes exposed in the initial transition. If they expand that downstream or sectorally, that could be north of 1,000. So they're trying to do something that's very, very difficult in a very short time period, with the added concerns of abatement costs, of geopolitical and everything else. So, of course, they're doing their best, and I get asked this all the time, but I like to say, patience is a virtue. The issue is having financial decisions made on this. And so if I'm a trader, if I'm looking, most of our traders, for example, they sell on, let's say, a 10-month forward contract, meaning by, let's say, even next month, they're already incurring CBAM exposure because they're selling forward steel, forward aluminum, even power. Some of our power clients sell on a 3-year forward contract. So how can they bake in the CBAM cost if they don't know the benchmark, which is an issue? Now you can pay, EY, you can pay us. We can create a guess more or less, right? But that's all we can do. But again, I do want to say, like, we have to appreciate what the European Commission is trying to do. You know, if they rush this, if they just give out a benchmark tomorrow, it may be that they didn't take their time and it's incorrect. Would you want that, or would you rather have them take their time and do it correctly? And so that's what I tell my clients when they push on the CBAM term all the time, the benchmarking. But it is, you know, in a rock, or between a rock and a hard place there. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And maybe getting close to the very end, we are getting close to the 60 minutes of this webinar. Like maybe last question for Vicente from Isabel Chamorro, which says, you mentioned the European Commission is working on the idea of default values for carbon prices in third countries. Will those default values be established country by country or horizontally? Or will be a combination of the two?
No, of course, they will have to be set up by country, because some countries do not have any carbon pricing, so it will be zero. Other countries have carbon pricing, which can be in different ways or it can be at different values. The difficulty here is that we cannot even have only one carbon price per country, possibly, because as in the European Union, there will also be, for example, there might be also be free allowances. Dan mentioned that, for example, in the UK, like in the EU, there are no free allowances for the power generation, but there are many free allowances, for example, in the sector of the steel, and less in other sectors. So depending on the risk of carbon leakage, the level of free allowances is different. So there will have to be different carbon price default values by countries, of course, and even in some countries, it will have to be differentiated even by sectors. So that's going to be a challenge. That's going to be something that will take time. And of course, that requires a lot of information from those countries and cooperation from those countries in order to be able. In any case, I have to say that unfortunately, the level of the carbon price in third countries is very, very low. I mean, except for maybe the UK, Canada, and other exceptions, I think that in general, the carbon price is very, very low. But of course, setting default values for carbon pricing is also an incentive for those countries to enhance or to increase their level of carbon pricing. So, and let's be clear, Omar, we are not obliging anyone to introduce carbon pricing. We don't force anyone to decarbonize in one particular specific way. What we want with CBAM is to treat all goods in the same way, in a even-handed manner, and of course also to promote the decarbonization. It can be done in many different ways. I mean, we know, for example, that the US will not have a federal carbon price. Some states have some sort of carbon price, like California, for example. This could be recognized, of course, but any efforts to decarbonize in one way or another, of course, that will have an impact also on the adjustment with the CBAM.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, so the CBAM is a very ambitious policy that is already generating global spillovers with so many jurisdictions that's trying to adopt similar policies. So for sure, we're going to have many more of these events in the future, and there's going to be part of this observatory of EsadeGeo and Fundación Repsol on the geopolitics of the energy transition. We're going to be following and track all the developments. And for this webinar, this is it. I want to thank Vicente and Dan for your participation. It's been fantastic and terrific to learning from two leading experts such as yourself. So thank you so much for being with us today. And on behalf of EsadeGeo and Fundación Repsol, also thank you, Raquel. We thank all the audience for having been with us today and for the questions that you sent us. And so we will continue to have this series of webinars also in the future. So follow us and we're going to be seeing in future events in over the next weeks and months. So thank you so much. Thank you again, Vicente and Raquel. Having a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for organizing this and for the invitation. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.